This is a story from Bulgaria, 1964, under the system that some called socialism and some called communism. I came into the kitchen and I saw his briefcase open on the table. He had never left it open before, never. There was a sheaf of papers. On top, a typed report. My eyes found the header before my mind understood what it was reading. Capital letters. Active operational interest. A name I knew. Her address. A column of contacts. I read it twice. Then I put it back exactly on the same place. That is what I have to live with. Not what I saw, but what I did next, or rather, did not do. She was my oldest friend. We had shared a desk at school, a pencil stub between us. She was the one person left in my life with whom I didn't have to pretend. 3 words. Active operational interest. She was sent to a village in the Vidin region, 11 years. She died in 2006. She never heard the thing I owed her. My name is Elitsa Boyadzhieva. I am 68 years old.
I remember the smell of our stairwell, cabbage soup and coal smoke and damp wool coats. That was the smell of ordinary life. It was the late 40s, and I was a girl in the Nadezhda district of Sofia. A neighborhood of tram lines and grey plaster blocks. Women with string bags. And a silence left by the war that nobody explained to children. We just knew not to ask about certain things. My father was a typesetter. He set letters in metal frames for the state printing house. He told him the alternative to joining the party was losing his shift. He came home that evening, hung his coat, and ate his supper. Watch from the doorway. School was on Lomsko Chose. That's where I met Vera. We were 9. We shared a desk. We had one pencil between us, a stub really. We'd swap it back and forth. We saw a poster for a French film once, on a kiosk near the university. We whispered about it for weeks, the glamour of it, a world we would never be allowed to see. That friendship, that whispering, it felt like the only private thing a person could own. My mother would send me to the food queues at 5 in the morning. Your feet went numb on the cobblestones. You learned to recognize the shape of a person's back in the dark. There was a year with no sugar. We'd pass a single piece of hard candy around the family table, each person pressing it to their tongue before dropping it into their tea. It never felt like deprivation, not then. On Thursday afternoons, we had pioneer meetings. We wore red scarves and sang songs about Georgy Dimitrov. I remember a feeling of the scarf knot under my chin. Or I believed that believing them was what you did. It was the texture of childhood, grey and red, and the taste of that candy in weak tea. I would sometimes visit my father at the printworks. I loved the smell of the ink, the lead type. He'd let me arrange a few letters. Oh, the whole line would be wrong. He was a careful man, a quiet man. He made sure the letters lined up. That was his job. I think he believed that if he just lined the letters up correctly, the words they formed wouldn't matter, or wouldn't be his responsibility. That's how we lived. You focused on the small, correct thing in front of you. The pencil stub. The place in the queue. The knot in the scarf. You didn't look at the larger picture it was forming. I didn't anyway. Not until much later. I often wonder about that silence of my father's, that swallowed decision. I think I mistook it for strength, for a kind of dignity. because when you grow up inside that silence, you start to think it's normal. You start to believe that the good things, the easier things, are just rewards for not asking questions. You begin to look at the world from the corner of your eye, not straight on. And you find yourself drawn to people who seem to live just above that waterline of ordinary struggle. People who wear coats that aren't Bulgarian and who never have to stand in the dawn queue.
I remember the paper snowflakes. They hung from the ceiling of the House of Culture, turning slowly in the heat of the bodies below. It was New Year's 1960 and I was 19, my head full of French subjunctives and the scent of Vera's perfume, which we shared. The band was playing and I was laughing at something, turning to find a place to set my glass down, when I saw him standing by the door. He wasn't dancing, he was watching in a wool overcoat the color of charcoal. It was the coat I noticed first. It had a weight, a drape to it that was not Bulgarian. The young men I knew wore jackets that were tied across the shoulders or their father's old coats. This was different. He introduced himself as Georgi. He was 24 and he worked for the Ministry of the Interior. Administrative work for state security, he said. I remember the phrase exactly. It sounded sophisticated, important. It did not sound to me then like something to be afraid of. Our courtship was a catalogue of small impossibilities. Tickets to the National Theatre, obtained without a 4-hour queue. A table at the Budapest restaurant on a Friday night. Once in his room on Rakovsky Street, he produced a small blue jar with a yellow label, Nescafe. I had never tasted it. He spooned the granules into 2 mismatched cups, boiled water on a single electric ring. The smell was foreign, bitter, and rich. We drank it black, looking out at the winter dusk settling over the rooftops. I have to say this, though I hate how it sounds. I was attracted to him, yes. He had a quiet certainty. But I was also attracted to the world he moved through. A life just above the waterline, where things were not so difficult to get, where an apartment might have a telephone. I knew girls from university who married for love and spent their first years of marriage sharing a kitchen with 3 other families. I told myself I was being practical. I see now I was making a choice. We were married in May of 1962. A civil ceremony at the People's Council office. A red banner on the wall, a registrar in a grey suit. We signed our names in a large ledger that smelled of old paper and ink. My parents were there, my father in his only suit. Georgie's father, a senior party man, gave the toast at the dinner in their apartment. He raised his glass first to the Bulgarian Communist Party for making such unions possible, then to us. I remember catching Vera's eye across the table. We stifled a laugh. We thought it was pompous, a little ridiculous. The formalism of an older generation. I didn't understand then that it wasn't a joke. It was the order of things. The party first. Everything else came after. I was so pleased with myself, you see. A university graduate, a married woman. Moving from my parents' flat in Nadezhda into a future that seemed for the first time spacious. I had no vocabulary yet for the cost of that space. No idea that the coat, the coffee, the tickets, they were not gifts. They were a language, and I was learning to speak it without asking what the words meant. The apartment came later, after our son was born. A 3-room flat on Vitosha Boulevard with a balcony that looked toward the mountain. People waited 12 years for such an apartment. For us, it took 8 months. A colleague's assistance, Georgie said. I didn't ask which colleague. By then, I had learned that some questions close doors, and I very much wanted to walk through the ones that were opening for me. We were on the waiting list for 8 months. The standard wait was 12 years. I remember the day the housing allocation notice came. Georgie placed it on the kitchen table, a single sheet of paper that felt heavier than it was. He said it was through a colleague's assistance. I did not ask which colleague. I had learned by then the shape of the questions I was not supposed to pursue. The apartment was proof. That's how I saw it. Proof that my life was real, that the choices I had made were correct. I would catalog its features to myself, like a prayer. A telephone. Almost no one had a telephone. A bathroom where hot water came from the tap most days. A balcony where I could stand and see the mountain, a solid, permanent thing. And the kitchen. It was large enough for a proper table. We ate there every evening, the 4 of us, while the radio played approved folk songs. The smell of our meals was different. Not cabbage soup from a communal pot, but pork with paprika, or sometimes, if Georgie could get it, a cut of beef. The proof extended beyond the front door. There was the CORECOM shop, a plain door on Patriarch Eftimi. You needed hard currency or a special pass. Georgie arranged one. Inside, it was quiet. The shelves held Yugoslav coffee, East German chocolate, French cosmetics. I remember buying a pair of French stockings. The sheer nylon felt like a secret against my skin. The pleasure was immediate. The shame came later, at school, sitting in the staff room with my colleagues. We shared a thermos of weak Bulgarian coffee. My coat, bought with that pass, hung on a separate peg. It was a better coat. They never mentioned it. We talked about lesson plans. I built walls in my mind, strong ones. The privileges were compensation, I told myself, for Georgie's difficult work, for the weight he carried. Every system has its hierarchies. Our children deserved stability, a view of the mountain, a father who could provide. These were not beliefs I examined. They were bricks I laid, one after the other, so I would not have to see over them. So I would not have to see the queue for milk that stretched around the block, or the family of 4 in a single room, or the face of a friend who could not enter that plain door on Patriarch Eftimi. The apartment was not just a home, it was a settlement, an agreement. I lived within its walls, and in return, I accepted a certain silence. I remember the quiet hum of the refrigerator, a sound so rare in Sofia then. It filled the spaces where questions might have been. I would stand at the balcony in the evenings after the children were asleep and look at the lights of the city spreading out below. My life felt elevated, separate. I told myself that was success. I know now it was a different kind of waiting. Georgi left every morning at 7:30. He carried a briefcase, brown leather, with a combination lock. I never asked for the combination. He returned at 7, sometimes 8. He would wash his hands at the sink in the bathroom before dinner. A thorough surgical scrubbing, I noticed it. I filed it under the category of hygiene. On certain evenings, he would say only, "A difficult day." And I would nod and set the table and turn on the radio. The music would cover the silence that followed. I learned the shape of that silence too. I learned to live around it, like a piece of furniture you stop seeing because it is always there. He left at 7:30 every morning, the sound of the briefcase latch clicking shut in the hallway. I never opened it. It wasn't a rule he stated. It was a fact of our life, like the balcony door that stuck in winter. He returned at 7, sometimes 8. He would go straight to the kitchen sink. I can still see his hands under the tap. He washed them with a kind of thoroughness, scrubbing the nails, the water running long after they were clean. I told myself it was hygiene. A man who worked in an office, who rode the tram. It was easier to believe that. On certain evenings, he would say only, "A difficult day." 2 words, "Tezak den." And I learned very quickly not to ask what the difficulty was. To ask would be to step across a line I had understood from the beginning was drawn in our home. So I would nod, I would set his plate down, and the difficulty would remain his. I thought I was being a good wife. I know now I was building a wall, and I was on the comfortable side of it. The closest I ever came to knowing was at a New Year's gathering. 1971. One of Georgi's colleagues, a man named Boris, had drunk too much slivova. He was laughing, his face flushed. He made a toast. To the ones who talk too much, he said, grinning, may they eventually learn to be quiet. He laughed. Georgie laughed. The others laughed. And I laughed too. My smile was a half-second late. My eyes were on Georgie's face, on the way his laughter didn't reach them. I have thought about that laugh every year since. What we were agreeing to in that room. You didn't need Georgie to explain the DS. You could feel it in the texture of things. The neighbor on the second floor. After his brother applied to emigrate to France, he stopped greeting anyone in the stairwell. He would look at his shoes, at the steps, at anything but your face. The silence was a physical thing. You learned to navigate around it. At my school, there was a French teacher, young, passionate. She had a copy of a Solzhenitsyn novel. Someone reported it, not a student, I don't think, a colleague perhaps. She was gone by the next term, transferred to a village school in the Rhodopes. We were told it was a staffing need. On, we all nodded. We understood the grammar of it. Certain names, too, would simply vanish from conversation. A writer, a cousin, an old friend. as if they had never existed. You didn't ask what happened. You just stopped saying the name. I constructed a life where the question of what his department actually did was never formed into words. Not in my mind, and certainly not aloud. I understood, without being told, that to form the question was to demand an answer. And an answer would require a decision from me, to stay or to go, to speak or to remain silent. I was not prepared to make that decision, so I chose not to know. It is a precise kind of ignorance. You cultivate it. You water it every day with your silence. And because I did not ask, I could tell myself I was innocent. I taught my classes. I raised my children. I made coffee in my privileged kitchen. I lived a life that felt, in so many ways, full. But it was a life built on a foundation I refused to examine. I had one friend who still lived outside that foundation, the one person who knew me from before, Vera. With her, I didn't have to pretend. With her, I could almost remember who I was before I learned to stop asking questions. I remember the exact weight of Vera's friendship. It was the weight of a life before. Before the apartment, before the pass, before I learned to measure my words. She was the one person with whom I could still say a thing I thought rather than a thing I was supposed to think. She had married an engineer, Dimitar, and they lived in a standard two-room flat in Mladost. There was no balcony with a mountain view. She never pretended the system was anything other than what it was. That was her quiet gift to me. She allowed me for an afternoon to stop pretending too. Her resistance was in the small things. A transistor radio kept in a kitchen drawer under a tea towel. She would pull it out when Dimitar was at the factory, and we would listen to the forbidden crackle of Radio Free Europe, our heads bent close to the speaker as if we were sharing a secret. Once she showed me a photograph cut from a foreign newspaper, the Prague Spring, 1968. It had been folded into the lining of a coat. We looked at those young faces, those tanks, and she didn't say a word. She just let me look. Another time, she passed me a typed carbon copy, the purple ink smudged, an essay by Georgy Markov. "Read it at home," she said, "then burn it." I did. I burned it in our bathroom sink. I watched the words curl into black ash, and I washed them away. It was a Tuesday afternoon in January. The light was that flat, gray winter light that never really brightens. Georgie had been called back to the office suddenly. I came into the kitchen, and his briefcase was open on the table. He never left it open. On top of a sheaf of papers was a typed report. My eyes found the header before my mind understood what it was. Capital letters, Stanshiva, Vera Georgieva. Then her address, a list of contacts, and the phrase, "Subject of active operational interest." I stood there for a long time. Then I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the table with that open briefcase. I drank the tea. It was tasteless. When Georgie returned, he came straight to the kitchen, snapped the briefcase shut, and left again with a nod. He didn't ask if I had seen. I didn't say I had. That evening I called Vera. to arrange a lunch for the following week. "A normal call," she answered. Her voice was exactly the same. "Elitsa," she said. And I said, "I'm well, how are you?" I listened to her talk about her daughter's school project. I made a sound of agreement. I said nothing. I said absolutely nothing. I put the receiver back in its cradle, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a door closing between two rooms. I was in one, she was in the other, and I had just turned the key. That was the moment, I think. That precise, ordinary moment of hanging up the phone. That is when the division of my life became permanent. There was the life I lived, the lunches I would still attend, the school where I taught, the apartment on Vitosha. And then there was the knowledge, which became a separate room inside me, a cold, silent room where Vera now lived. A room I would visit every day for years, but never speak of. I had chosen which side of the door to stand on. And after that, there was no going back. There were only the questions I would learn not to ask. I remember those years as a kind of double life. Not a dramatic one, with secret meetings or hidden messages. The opposite. The surface life was so full, so normal. School terms, marking papers, parent-teacher conferences. Summer holidays at the party resort in Druzhba, the children building sandcastles, the smell of salt and cheap sunscreen. Martha's pioneer ceremony, her red scarf so bright against her white blouse. Nikolai's university entrance, the pride in his eyes. A good life, a full life, and underneath it, a silence. A name I never said. Not to Georgie, not to anyone. I developed strategies, small, precise rituals of avoidance. I took Vera's phone number out of my address book. I copied it onto a loose slip of paper and I tucked it into my French dictionary between the pages for oubliette and oubli, a forgetting place. As if demoting it from a permanent record to a forgotten bookmark could lessen its weight. When colleagues asked, I said she had moved to Plovdiv for family reasons, a neutral, plausible distance. I did not attend our school class reunion in 1980. I knew her absence would be a quiet topic, a murmured question, and I could not sit in a room where her ghost was more present than I was allowed to be. The privileges continued, of course. The apartment, the car, the CORECOM pass that slipped so easily from my wallet. I never once connected them, explicitly, to what I had seen on that kitchen table. To do that would have been to form a sentence in my mind, my comfort is purchased with her suffering. It was a grammatical impossibility. My mind refused to assemble the words. Then, in the spring of 1983, her husband Dimitar came to the school gate. I was on morning duty. He was standing there in a jacket that had grown too big for him. He didn't call my name. He just waited until I approached. His face was the face of a man who had been asking the same question for 6 years and had learned to ask it quietly without hope. "Elitsa," he said, "have you heard anything?" "Anything at all?" I told him I had not. which was true in the narrowest sense. I had heard nothing. I had made sure of it. I watched him nod, accept this nothing as his due, and walk away. I turned, went back inside, up the stairs to my classroom. I taught a lesson on the passé composé, the tense of completed action, j'ai fini. I have finished. The seasons turned. The children grew. The silence became a room inside me, furnished and familiar. I learned to walk around it. At Druzhba, I would sit at the water's edge after Georgie and the children had gone back to the room. I would look at the Black Sea, this vast flat expanse that went all the way to the Soviet Union, and I would think about nothing at all. That was the skill I honed, not thinking. It was a discipline as rigorous as any other. 11 years. You can build a whole life in that time. You can also bury one. I did both. I told myself that by not knowing, I was not responsible. But of course, the not knowing was the choice, every single day. I would look at Georgie across the dinner table, listen to him talk about his day, about some administrative problem, and the question was right there, behind my teeth. It never came out. The weight of our life together, the apartment, the children, the future we had built, was heavier than the weight of that single name. That is the simple, ugly arithmetic of it. And then, in late 1988, I heard a piece of ordinary news at a market stall. A former colleague mentioned it while selecting apples. Did you hear? Vera Stancheva is back in Sofia, just like that. The sentence entered me, and the 11 years of not asking ended. The question was no longer mine to hold. It was now a fact, sitting in the world, waiting for me. The cold that spread through my chest wasn't surprise. It was the end of the postponement. Time was up. I heard about Vera's return at a market stall. Late autumn, the last of the peppers were wrinkled in their crates. A woman from our old school class was buying potatoes. She said as she weighed them in her hand, "You know Vera Stancheva is back in Sofia." Just like that. As if she were telling me the price of cabbage. The cold started in the center of my chest, a sharp spreading chill. It was the thing I had been holding off for 11 years. It had finally arrived. For 2 months I did nothing. I wrote letters I tore up. I took the slip of paper from my French dictionary, that number I had kept but never dialed, and I would lift the receiver, listen to the dial tone, and set it back in the cradle. I constructed speeches in my head. They always began, "Vera, I didn't know what to do." And they always collapsed. Because I did know. I knew exactly what I had done, which was nothing. I took the tram to Mladost in February. A bitter, clear day. I stood outside her block for 20 minutes. My breath was a cloud in front of my face. I just watched the entrance. Finally, I pressed the buzzer. Her voice came through the intercom. "Da, just that." I said my name. There was a silence so long I thought the connection had broken. Then she said, "Come up." 2 words. I climbed the 4 flights. Each step felt like a sentence being passed. Not on her, on me. Her apartment was sparse. A few pieces of furniture, as if she hadn't fully moved back in. She was thinner. Her hair, which she'd always worn long, was cut short. There was a stillness about her. A quietness that hadn't been there before. She made coffee on a small stove. We sat at her table. She placed the cups between us. Then she looked at me, not with anger, but with a terrible, exhausted clarity. She said, "I know you saw the file, Elitsa." My heart stopped. She said, "Dimitar told me." Georgie's department had a copy made for the record. He found out 2 years ago. She had known for 2 years. She had carried that knowledge, and she had come back to Sofia, and she had waited to see if I would come. I couldn't speak, I couldn't breathe. The room was silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the elevator in the shaft. We just sat there. The coffee grew cold between us. I wanted to explain, but every explanation I had rehearsed was a lie. I had known. I had chosen the apartment, the past, the quiet life. I had chosen my husband over my friend. To say I was afraid was true, but it was not the whole truth. I was also comfortable. I was complicit. She had lived the consequences, and I had lived with the knowledge. They were not the same thing. We both knew they were not the same thing. That winter passed. We did not speak again. I would look at Georgie across our kitchen table, the one from the CORECOM shop, and I would see a stranger. The architecture of my life, all those privileges I had catalogued so carefully, began to feel like a cell. I waited for something to break. And then, that November, it did. He didn't say anything. That's what I remember. The newsreader's voice, the image on the screen. Georgie sat beside me on the sofa, and when it was clear what was happening, that it was actually happening, he said nothing. He stood up. He went to the kitchen, and I heard the sound of the cabinet, and he came back with a glass of rakia. He stood at the balcony window and looked at Vitosha mountain. He stood there for a long time. I watched his back, the set of his shoulders. And I understood in that moment, with the clarity I had been avoiding for 27 years, that I did not know what the thing I had been married to would look like without the system that had made it possible. The weeks that followed had a quality I cannot quite describe, like watching a building come down slowly, one floor at a time. The newspapers began printing names, names from the DS files, names from interrogation records. People read them on the tram, in the queue at the bread shop. Our neighbors stopped greeting Georgie in the stairwell. Not because they knew specifically, I don't think they knew specifically. But something in the air had shifted, and people were recalibrating, and Georgie was on the wrong side of the new arithmetic. One morning I came into the kitchen and saw that the balcony door was open. It was March, still cold. I went to look. Georgie was standing at the metal rubbish bin we kept out there, feeding papers into it. He was doing it methodically, one sheet at a time, watching each one catch and burn. The smoke went straight up in the still air. He didn't look at me. I stood in the doorway. I watched him for perhaps 2 minutes. Then I went back inside and put the kettle on. I did not ask. That is the detail I returned to. The practical architecture of our life dismantled itself in stages. The CORECOM pass came up for renewal and was not renewed. The Moskvitch needed work, a bearing, something in the gearbox, and there was no longer a colleague to arrange it through ministry channels. It sat in the courtyard for 3 months. In March 1990, Georgi was retired from the Ministry of the Interior. The letter came on a Tuesday. He placed it on the kitchen table, the same way he had placed the housing allocation notice 25 years before. He didn't say anything then either. The telephone was still there, of course. It had always been there on the side table. But it rang less. And when I looked at it, it no longer meant what it had meant. It was suddenly just a telephone. A piece of plastic with a rotary dial. I remember standing in the hallway looking at it and thinking, that is the whole story. That is what I traded 30 years of silence for. A telephone that is now just a telephone. I want to be precise about what I grieved. I did not grieve the regime. I was not one of the people who wept for Zhivkov, who felt the world had ended. What I grieved was the version of myself that the regime had made possible. The woman who had a reason for her silence that was also, conveniently, a reward for it. Who could say, even to herself in the dark, this is the price of living this way, and I have accepted it, and at least the price makes sense. That woman was gone. What was left was just me, in this apartment. With this man, I was no longer sure I had ever fully looked at. And with the question I had been carrying since January 1977, which no longer had any architecture to hide inside. We met for coffee, perhaps once a year. We spoke on the telephone. We talked about our children, about the price of bread, about the ache in our knees when it rained. We never spoke of 1977. Not after that first conversation in her apartment. It was as if we had agreed, without ever agreeing, to build a new friendship around the edges of that hole. We were two people who had to share a room, and we learned to walk around it without ever looking down. It was a kind of tenderness, I think, and a kind of cowardice, mine, not hers. I carried the weight of what I hadn't said, and she carried the weight of what had happened to her, and we pretended these weights were not the reason we sometimes fell silent in the middle of a sentence. In 1997, I finally asked her. We were in the same cafe. I remember the light was flat that afternoon. I asked her what the 11 years had been, where they sent her. She stirred her coffee. She told me in a voice that was completely empty. A village near Vidin, a job at a tomato canning factory. 2 winters where the pipes froze and she slept in her coat. A pregnancy that ended in 1979. She said the word miscarriage as if she were reading it from a report. She said she blamed the cold, the work, the fear. She came back only after some review, some piece of paper in 1988. She had told the story before. To officials, to doctors, perhaps to her husband. She had sanded all the feeling out of it. I listened, and I knew I had to ask the other question, the one I had carried for 20 years. My voice felt very small. I said, "Did you know it was me? That I saw the file and I said nothing?" She put her spoon down. She looked at me, and for a second the emptiness was gone. She said, "I suspected. After Dimitar spoke to you at the school and you told him you knew nothing, I suspected. But I told myself you couldn't have known what it meant." She paused. I needed to believe that. And I said nothing. I nodded. I let the silence hold her belief. I let her have the version of me that was merely ignorant, not complicit. I did not correct her. That is the thing I find hardest to say. In that moment, I chose my comfort over her truth. Again, we continued to talk, of course. We moved back to the safe ground of tomatoes and grandchildren. That was the last time we ever approached the edge. We became better at avoiding it. She died in 2006, a stroke. We had spoken on the phone the week before. She was complaining about the price of zucchini at the market. An ordinary conversation. At the funeral, I stood apart from the family. I watched them lower her into the ground. And I understood, with a clarity that was physical, that the conversation I owed her was now impossible. The full accounting, the undefended confession. I had waited for a courage that never arrived, and now the only person who needed to hear it was gone. Was the consequence. Not her anger, her absence. I would carry the unfinished sentence for the rest of my life. I went home to my apartment, the same one. I stood on the balcony, and I realized that for decades I had been waiting for an ending. For Vera to forgive me or to condemn me, for some final judgment, but her death taught me there is no ending like that. There is only the carrying. You are left with what you did and what you didn't do. And you have to find a way to live in the room with it alone. I am 68 years old. I live alone in the apartment on Vitosha Boulevard. Georgie died of a heart attack in 2003. The children are in other cities. The mountain is still there, outside the balcony window. It is the same view. It is a completely different view. I agreed to sit here and speak to this camera because I am tired. I am tired of the version of myself I have been carrying, the one I have edited and corrected and polished for 30 years. I want to put it down somewhere outside my own head. Even if it is too late for it to matter to anyone it should have mattered to. Perhaps especially then, so an accounting. What I knew and when. I knew by 1971 that Georgie's department caused harm to people. I knew it from the jokes at parties, from the names that disappeared from conversation, from the teachers sent to the rodopes. I knew in January of 1977 that Vera was a target. I saw her name on that typed sheet. I read the words active operational interest. I understood what they meant. I chose not to warn her. I chose not to ask Georgie a single question that would require me to act. I continued to live in this apartment. I used the pass for the CORECOM shop. I drove the car. I made the coffee. I did not ask. And in 1997, when Vera gave me the opportunity, when she said she told herself I couldn't have known what it meant. I did not correct her. I let her believe the lie that was easier for her to carry. I have not, until this moment, said all of this consecutively to another person. The question I know you have: was I a victim of the system or a participant in it? I have spent 30 years constructing an answer to that question that lets me sleep. The honest answer is that I was both. And that being both is not the same as being neither. The system did not run on conviction alone. It ran on accommodation. It required people like me, not the ones who gave the orders, the ones who made the coffee and didn't ask, the ones who enjoyed the warmth of the apartment and accepted that the price of the view was not looking too closely at how it was paid for. What I am left with is the silence, not the silence the regime imposed, the one I chose. It began in January 1977. It lasted until I walked into this room to speak to you, 32 years. I don't know if telling you this now makes me better or just less burdened. I think there is a difference. I think I am, at best, less burdened. I think that will have to be enough. Vera deserved more than enough, but Vera is gone. And I am the one who is still here, in this apartment, with this view. And this is what I have to give.